Welcome back to the shop. We have a very common problem in the shop. The family has this well-loved kitchen table that has seen a lot of use, and you're starting to see the finish disappear, starting to see it break down a little bit, starting to see the veneer on the sides start to break. And the question becomes, do you repair it, do you refinish it, or do you buy a new table? Now, this table is in great shape other than the finish. So for this customer, we're going to repair the veneer that is pulled away on some of these edges, as well as on the support arms. You can see it's kind of peeling away. But then we're going to strip down this top, refinish it back to the original stain color, and get a couple coats of polyurethane on it so we can bring this tabletop back to life. One of the first steps in a project is to understand what steps you should take in the refinishing process. You go through and just strip this right off and then begin the refinishing work and then do your repairs. Or you could do your repairs first. And I've gone through and I've seen that there's definitely some veneer that has pulled apart here. And my concern is if I start to apply stripper to this, start sanding it, etc., I'm going to make this damage even worse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I'm going to repair this veneer and then begin my refinishing process, because otherwise this will completely break off and we won't be able to match it. So let's start with a repair of this damaged veneer edge. One of the first things I want to do is understand how deep this damage goes. And you can see it's kind of peeling back here. And as I press it down, it goes down in place. But as I run my finger across, I can actually feel a bump right here, which tells me there's some sort of debris or something in there that if I glue this down, I'm going to wind up with a bump in the veneer. So I'm going to take a very fine X-Acto knife, kind of clean it out a little bit to get the old glue out, and then we're going to insert some hide glue in there to be able to hold this piece down so that it glues. So now I've gone through this entire edge and I tested all of the edge veneer and I can see where it's kind of pulling away. And I put some tape on it saying from here to here, from here to here, here to here, and here to here is where we have veneer pulling away. This area that had the most damage, I went through with the X-Acto knife and I cleaned out what was in there so now it will sit flush once I glue it back. And what I cleaned out was fuzzies, little pieces of crumbs of dirt, etc., so that now I can apply some glue and fasten this back so this veneer will be solid. It's important that you get that done before you start to do any stripping, because otherwise that will just peel off as you're doing your sanding. And I've gone through and I've investigated all the edges of the tables, and this is the one with the most damage, so we're going to focus on this one first. So having identified what areas need repair, I've marked it off with the tape with the arrows. I'm now going to use some hide glue and put it in a syringe so that I can squirt it down into the veneer. I'll then clamp it on using a combination of both clamps as well as some blue masking tape. So the first and the most damaged veneer is right down here. So I'm just taking the syringe, peeling it back, and inserting the hide glue down into that veneer. The tip of the syringe is thin enough that I can actually peel it back a little bit. But what I'm also going to do is take an X-Acto knife and kind of just force that down a little bit into the veneer. I can feel a deep cavity there. So I'm going to put a little bit more glue there. So now that I have that on there, I'm going to press, and I'm getting some pretty good glue squeeze out. And then using my water just to clean it up just a little bit. I'm going to just push that across, and again, I'm getting some good glue squeeze out. So now I'm going to dry it off, get the water off of there. And use my blue masking tape. Come up under and then across the top to squeeze that veneer in tight. It seems to be tightening up very nicely. A couple more pieces on here. Again, I'm not too concerned about the cleaning up the glue squeeze out because I'm doing this repair before I actually strip the piece. All right, we got that on there. So now, come across, we've got a little bit more veneer peeling right here. Not a lot, but enough that if we don't get to it and we start the stripping process, it will peel right off. So I'm just going to use my finger and work that in. Again, use my masking tape trick here to pull that veneer up tight. All right, and now I'm going to continue that all the way down the rest of this piece. This piece of the veneer top is loose, but it's not down deep enough. So I'm taking the X-Acto knife and just going along and trying to peel it back a little bit. As you can see, it's going pretty well. And what I'm doing is slicing out the old glue that was there. See how it opens up a little bit? So now I go back to my syringe and my X-Acto knife. And just squirt that right in there. Now, one of the things that I did with the hide glue before I put it in the syringe is I let the bottle of hide glue sit in a jar of hot water. And what that does is it softens it up a little bit so the viscosity flows that much better through the syringe. It does not take a lot of glue to do this, but we want to work that down into that seam because it's going to take abuse over the years, and it has. So now as I squeeze this, you can start to see the hide glue popping out. So now I'm going to go across and do the exact same thing with the masking tape and use that as a clamp. So now we'd be in the process of actually applying stripper to this top. Now remember, this is a veneered top, so we want to do our best we can to strip as much as we can off, because we want to limit how much sanding we have to do, because we don't want to cut through that veneer. So the trick to applying stripper is you always want to keep a wet edge, and you always want to go in the exact same direction. And the longer the stripper can sit that it's wet, the better job it will do removing the old surface. So we know this is a lacquered top, and there's probably either stain in the lacquer or stain in the table itself. So we'll go through, we're going to apply this stripper, let it sit for probably about 10 or 15 minutes, because it takes patience to be able to allow that stripper to do its work and lift up the old finish. One of the things you'll notice is that I'm wearing a shop apron just to kind of keep the junk off of me as we remove the finish. I'm also wearing protective gloves. And in a few minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that shop fan on, because the fumes from the stripper are very strong. So I'm just going to get this applied on. And we'll do a section at a time. You don't want to do the entire top, because then the stripper will dry and you're left with a goopy mess that does not come off. So I'm starting to see some of this dry already, so I'm just going back over it. And we'll let this sit for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and we'll scrape it off. So we've let this sit now, and when it was kind of getting near the end of time on it, I then applied some stripper on this side. That way I can get multiple work going on here. And then the stripper has applied, and you just see it scraping right off, which is great. Now, don't be surprised if all the finish doesn't come off the very first time you do it. You may need to apply a second round of stripper to it. But the trick is you want to get as much of it off as you can. And that is actually done pretty well. So now I'm going to apply another coat of stripper on there. But it has done a great job getting down to that bare veneer. But again, it really comes back to patience, letting the chemical do its job, so you don't have to spend a bunch of time fighting with it. All right, so there's that second coat. Now we'll move over to this side where we applied this stripper. I may not have let this one sit long enough because it didn't clean up as nicely. So we'll apply a second coat over there, and we're going to keep going on this tabletop. So we've got the top strip. Now I'm going to start working on the edges. And this tabletop is really heavy. So that's why the advantages of my adjustable workstation here really works to my advantage. So I don't have to bend down. I can work right at eye level so I can see the piece. Now I'll just do the exact same thing that I did with the tabletop. Apply that, and then just go around the edges, let it sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then come back and scrape it off. But this is actually cleaning up pretty nicely. I am seeing some other spots where some veneer is lifting up a little bit. There's definitely a piece of veneer missing here that we'll have to repair during the refinishing process. But for the most part, it's cleaning up pretty well. So the top is stripped. So now what do you do after you did that? Is all the finish gone? Most of it is gone, but not all of it. So the most important thing is read the side of the can of stripper that you're using. The stripper that I'm using recommends doing a wash down with a Scotch-Brite pad and an odorless mineral spirits to clean it off. I don't use mineral spirits to do it because I know that there is lacquer on this, and mineral spirits or paint thinner will not cut through lacquer. So what I'm doing is I actually have a dish with some lacquer thinner in it. I've got a 7440 Scotch-Brite pad, which is equivalent to about 80 to 100 grit. And all I'm going to do is go through and do an after wash here to try and get off any additional lacquer that may be on here, as well as to neutralize the stripper that's on here as well too. And you can see the lacquer thinner is actually clouding up, which tells me that I'm pulling more finish off of this. So now I'll go through with this Scotch-Brite pad and I will do all the top, the edges, and then I'll be able to get a good look at the top and see what's left, and then come back and do some sanding just to finish cleaning it up a little bit. But I can see the slurry being created with the lacquer thinner and the stripper and whatever finish is left on this tabletop. And you can actually see the grain coming right through down to the bare surface. So I'm going to keep going across this whole top. You notice I'm flooding it a little bit. I'm going to go across this entire top and get it cleaned up. So we've stripped this down. We've given it a wash of lacquer thinner. And the question you ask is all the lacquer gone? Is all the finish gone? Let's see. This is our second wash down with lacquer thinner. And it is cleaning up nicely. You can actually see a lot of the old finish coming off that was left. So now I've wiped that with lacquer thinner. Now I'm going to take a white cloth and wipe it some more. Wipe off that lacquer thinner. Look at that. There's still finish on there. So this will get us 90% of the way there, that we get as much of the finish off as we can. And then we'll go back, and once we've given this the bath to neutralize the stripper, as well as getting any other remaining lacquer off the top, we'll come back with 100 or 120 grit paper and just sand the rest of the top. I'm going to continue this wipe down, get rid of as much of that old finish as possible. So we've allowed time for the glue on the veneer to dry. I've removed the clamps. Now I'm going to start to remove our masking tape and see how we did. This was the most concerning piece of veneer that was peeling back, and it has solidly filled right in, and that bump that we had is gone. So there's still some glue on there, but that's okay because we're going to strip the piece now, and I'm going to go through and keep checking to see how our veneer repairs worked. Again, they're doing pretty well. So I'm going to continue removing all of my tape from here, and then we'll start the process of stripping back the piece. The tabletop and the side leaves have all been stripped using the stripper, and then I used a Scotch-Brite pad with lacquer thinner to remove all the residue stripper, as well as remove any remaining lacquer that was on the tabletop. I then hand sanded it down with 100 grit paper and then 120 grit paper. So these have been sanded with 100 grit. I'm going to now hit those with 120. And I emphasize here that I'm hand sanding. Now, could I have used a Reynolds orbital sander or a palm sander? Absolutely. But what I've noticed is that the veneer on this table is very thin. And if I used a Reynolds orbital sander or a palm sander to do it, then I run the risk of blowing through the veneer and then having to do a repair patch afterwards. And it would always still show. So I use the extra time, spend the extra time, do some hand sanding, and what I do is I wipe it down, get all the residue off, sand it with 100, blow off the dust, wipe it down with paint thinner, let that dry, then sand it with 120, wipe it down with paint thinner, and let that sit overnight before I'll apply any stain to it. So now I'm going to hit these with 120. I'll do the exact same thing. I'll blow the dust off, and then I'll wipe them down with a rag with paint thinner, and then we're ready for staining. But it's a good solid block. You don't want to use your fingertips because you'll risk it rounding it. So a good solid block thing with the grain and just going through and removing all the scratches from the 100 grit. Now, I'm not going to go up to 150 or 220 with the sanding because I'm going to be applying a stain, and I need the grit in the grain in the wood to be able to bind the pigments from the stain. If I was going to spray lacquer on this or toned lacquer, then I could sand this up to 220, but I'm not doing that. I'm applying a stain and I'm going to polyurethane. So the most I want to do is 120, maybe 150 before applying the stain. But I've had good luck stopping at 120, so that's what I'm going to do on this tabletop. With all of our prep work now complete, we're ready to apply a stain to this tabletop. So just as a recap, what we do, we stripped it down, removed all the old finish. We wiped it down with lacquer thinner to get all the old lacquer and off of the piece and all the stain off. We then sanded it with 100 and then 120 grit paper. I'm now going to be applying an oil-based stain that matches the original color for the set. And all I'm going to do is use a soft white cloth and liberally apply the stain. Now the trick to staining is get as much of it into all of the grain, and it's okay when you're first applying the stain that you get some puddling, because what you want to do is allow that stain to settle in to the grit and the ridges that were left from your sanding. And we talked about earlier what grit of sandpaper to use. And if you're going to be staining, you definitely do never want to go beyond 120 or 150 in terms of the grit of paper. Because what that does is it polishes the wood. And what you want to have happen is with a slightly rougher grit, which I use the 120, it leaves little spots for the pigment in the stain to sit. And that's really what's happening, is the pigment is sitting within those grooves of your sandpaper. And if you apply too much sanding, the 220 or even higher, then what will happen is there's no place for that pigment to sit. And then what happens is the wood gets polished and you get a very, very light stain. So we're going to go across this entire piece, apply all the stain to all these leaves as well as to the table itself. We're going to let it sit for about 10 or 15 minutes. We don't want it to dry, but we want to allow it to settle in. Let it sit 10 or 15 minutes and then come back with a clean white cloth and wipe off any excess stain that's left. So I'm going to keep going here and applying our stain. So the same process we used to stain the leaves, we're going to come through now and stain the tabletop. Again, I'm using swirl actions to kind of really get that stain into the grain of the veneer. And there's really no right or wrong way in terms of the application of the stain. You can use a rag like I use, and you'll see some people actually use a brush. And either one really works. It's just a matter of what your personal preference is. I actually prefer the cloth because it gives me a little bit more control in terms of the application of the stain and kind of get that really into all of the fine details of the tabletop. So again, we'll get this stain on. We'll let it sit probably about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're going to come back and just wipe off any excess stain that's there. So the initial puddling you see is totally fine. It'll just be a matter of coming back later on and removing all that puddling. Now the stain has had a chance to sit. I'm now coming back with a cloth and I'm wiping off any of the excess stains so we don't get any puddling. And you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm constantly rotating the rag, but then I'm also following the grain. There's a really neat pattern in this table where it's on angles into the center. And what I want to make sure of is that I stay with those angles. So again, just wiping off any excess that's there, cleaning out the grooves, staying with my angles. And now I'm just going to investigate to make sure that there's no excess puddles. And I think we are good. Now the tabletop has been stained, we know what color the entire tabletop is going to be. So we can start to tackle some of this missing veneer repair. There's a few options. You can try and fit in a veneer patch. You can use an epoxy stick. You could use a hard wax stick. But my go-to is actually to use plastic wood and then tone it. So that's what we're going to do now. This wood filler is acetone based, so it dries very, very quickly. And it dries to a very strong, durable patch. So all I'm going to do is feed it into this patch and it dries like super quick. So what I'm able to do is get this filled in. I'll let it dry for a little bit. Then I'll come back and I'll level it off and then add color to match the rest of the piece. So now I've let this patch dry for about 10 minutes and I'm just taking a very fine bench chisel and coming across and removing any of the high spots. to reveal the patch. Now, what's nice about this stuff is if you find that once you remove the high spots, you do a little bit of sanding, if it's still not where you want it to be, you can apply another coat and it will blend right in. So that's still a little rough, so I'm going to take some 220 paper and lightly sand it. And the patch isn't exactly where I want it to be just yet. There's still some roughness to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, take some more of the filler, and apply it. And again, I'm going proud because I can always remove the excess. All right, we're going to let this sit for about 10 minutes. And we'll come back and we'll clean that up. Now that our patch is complete, we're going to move on to the touch-ups to blend it all in. So I've just got some pigment of some raw umber, which is a good match for the background color of this oak. And I'm just going to come through and using an artist brush, just touch up where we made our patch. So after several applications of the raw umber with a mix of denatured alcohol, you can actually see that that patch has actually blended in pretty well. And then once we get the polyurethane on the table, that should pretty much disappear. With all of our repairs complete, we're now going to apply the final finish to this dining set. I'm going to be using a satin polyurethane, and my first coat I always add a little bit of paint thinner to thin the polyurethane. It allows for a smoother application, and with the paint thinner added to the polyurethane, it actually dries just a little bit faster. So I'm using a nice China bristle brush. I've had my polyurethane sitting for a moment or two in the glass jar to allow any bubbles to dissipate. And then what I want to do is make sure that I get a good soaking into my brush so that I don't get any dry brush strokes. So the first thing I want to do is hit the edge. And the trick with polyurethane is that you always want to keep a wet edge so that as you're applying it, you have the wet edge, and that prevents a lot of drip marks. As you're applying it. And it makes the finish a little bit smoother. What you'll notice is I'm constantly going against the wet edge. And unlike painting where you go from dry to wet, I'm actually going from wet to dry. And that gives us a nice even application across the table. So the other thing you'll notice is I'm doing the edges first, and then that way any polyurethane that comes in contact with the top, you don't get a bubble or drips on the edges. And you'll notice I always talk about this table that I use for my repair work. And this is an old sit-stand workstation. So what it allows me to do is raise and lower it as I need to. It's also on wheels. So then I can actually move it around the shop and be able to get a full 360 work surface. Again, you see it going from wet to dry, and I'm tipping off as I go through. So I'm going to be here for a while. So I'm going to keep going with the application of this polyurethane on these leaves and then onto the tabletop. And then once it dries, we'll come back and we'll show you what the next step is after the application of the polyurethane. The first coat of polyurethane has sat overnight to dry. And as you feel the tops, they're a little bit rough. You can actually see some dust particles, maybe some bubbles that are in it, but that's okay. This is just the first step in applying the finish. What we're going to do now is we're going to sand with 220 grit paper. And the objective of our sanding is just to remove those raised areas on the finish. We don't want to cut through the finish. So it's going to be very soft, very light as we go through. We'll go across all the leaves as well as the tabletop. I'm using a block, some 220 grit paper, and this is the extent of the sanding. You don't see me scrubbing. I'm just going through and just removing the high spots and the dust particles that are here. Now you'll start to see a very fine powder start to appear on the top, and what you're doing is you're just removing that upper layer of polyurethane and you're leveling it out. What you want to be careful of is you don't cut through the finish, but that you're left with a nice silky smooth top. So again, I'm using the block with the 220 grit sandpaper. I want to remove anything that's glossy, and that just tells me whether or not I've covered the whole thing. I'm also going to do the edges. And this is where you'll find if you had any drips, and the edges are the primary locations where you're going to see drips. All right. And now we'll come through and we'll do the other edge. Again, just see me gently going across to remove the high spots. I've got some drips here. I'm going to be a little bit more intentional as I sand to get those drips out. All right, so that's the process. So I'm going to go through now. I'm going to do the 4 leaves as well as the tabletop. Once I'm done, I'm then going to use a clean white rag with some paint thinner to remove that dust, that fine level of dust. And then we'll apply our finish coat of polyurethane. So we're in the last step of this dining set restoration. And what we're doing now is we're applying a coat of wax to the leaves as well as the tabletop. And I'm using some 4/0 steel wool, and I'm just loading that wax onto the steel wool. And I'm applying it liberally to the top. And really what that's doing is it's smoothing out the finish just a little bit more so that any dust particles or raising of the polyurethane will be smoothed out. And what we'll do is we'll apply this. We'll let it just glaze over for a while. It probably takes about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and buff it off with a clean cloth. Now, I'm a firm believer that you should wax after you've applied a finish to a tabletop because what it does is a couple things. It adds another layer of protection to the finish, which is not long term because it will wear off, but it just provides that additional layer of protection. And then when I deliver it to the customer, I recommend to them that they apply a coat of wax to the top probably once a year just to protect the finish. It's just that little bit extra that makes a difference. So I'm going to keep going and then we'll buff it all out and then we'll reassemble this table. Here are some before and after pictures of the table. You can see on the left, you can see the water stains as well as the broken veneer, and then the work that we did to strip and refinish. And then here's a shot of the table in the customer's home, surrounded by the beautiful set of chairs. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this and any other furniture repair and shop related videos on my channel. I hope you find them informative, that they help you when repairing a piece of furniture or working in your shop. Please consider liking and subscribing, sharing any and all of my videos. Your support is greatly appreciated.